Howdy, howdy, y'all! It's Tuesday, which means it's time for another Some Antics. Today I am joined by the one and only Crystal Preston-Watson. Crystal, how's it going?
It's going good. Thank you for having me on here.
I'm super excited to have y'all. We've actually just been chatting about our cats. Pre-show, we were chatting about both of us have cats who are prone to barging into closed office doors at any moment. So you might see Tuna, you might see some of Crystal's cats, but we can only hope, right? Um,
Yes.
so, Crystal, welcome to the show. For folks who don't know who you are, would you care to give yourself an introduction?
Yes. So, Crystal Preston-Watson, and I am a quality and accessibility engineer. Currently, I work at salesforce.org, where I do that accessibility and quality engineering for supporting accessibility for nonprofit cloud, education cloud, and philanthropy clouds there. Um, yeah, so that's my main job, and some people know me from social media as someone who likes to meme. So it's a duality of where people and I do a lot of talks about accessibility and some videos when I feel like it.
So, what is the best accessibility meme you've shared recently on the socials?
um, though I think a lot of people would say was the Attack on Titan, and I don't know, I really love that one, but I would also say it was the Tekken one that I
Okay.
shared that didn't get enough love. I feel because maybe it was just it was like it was one of the end scenes for Tekken, and I used it to talk about teams who
Hmm.
do accessibility sprints, but then they ship out. They're not actually that accessible. So I love it, but yeah, Attack on Titan and the Tekken one. Those are my two favorite ones so far.
Good deal. So today we're going to be doing testing mobile accessibility. What is your background with that?
Yeah, so I started with accessibility about 20 15, 2016. But when it kind of first kind of like getting to as a QA, getting a random ticket. But then when I decided, I was like, accessibility is something I really want to do. I actually ended up joining a company, as some people may know, Aetna, uh, as a QA, and there I wasn't really actually supposed to do like accessibility outright, but then that kind of ended up being my main role. And so I pretty much focused on native application, iOS, Android, applications and testing them for accessibility.
All right. So my background has been, largely with desktop web accessibility. So one of the things I'm really curious about is mobile accessibility all that different from desktop web accessibility?
It's not, so you do, especially, and I always, is it WCAG? It's WCAG. So you still need to make sure, especially, and that, things do meet WCAG guidelines, and there are, especially when it comes to color contrast when and other, making sure you have programmable labels and things. So there's a lot that are shared between desktop accessibility and mobile accessibility.
Okay.
But when it comes to mobile accessibility, especially with, I mean, especially when you get into native applications, you are dealing with things like, one thing that you can't do with a desktop, well, I guess you can, is the orientation of the screen, changing that,
Mm.
making sure, like, one thing's that, it's really, adding peripherals onto a desktop computer is usually not a huge issue. Like, if it says that peripheral says, hey, work with Mac OS, if I work, with Windows or whatever, you're usually good to go to kind of plug and play. Um, that can be an issue, especially with mobile accessibility, because a lot of people don't really think about that. they like, well, you have the device and that's it. And there are a lot of people, you know, with disabilities that having a external peripheral is necessary, like a braille keyboard,
Hmm.
other just not even just just a external keyboard anyway. Like my husband, when he uses his iPad, he more likely will attach a keyboard to it because that is the way.
Mm.
And so that also kind of shows it's not just for people with disabilities, but just a preference of of users in general. So thinking on things about that. So there's a lot that it overlaps, but there's special considerations, and then just the fact that like with anything you have
Hmm.
operating systems. You have Android, you have iOS, you have the kind of quirks and things that go in between, which is again same for desktop because you have Mac OS, you have like Windows, and there's quirks and things like
Hmm.
that as well.
What are some of those quirks and differences between Android and iOS? Like, I assume you can't just like test one operating system and call it a day.
No, you definitely can't. And when it comes, and so usually if you're just testing mobile web, and then when I say mobile web, that's the kind of in browser, like
Hmm.
you have Safari or Chrome, and you pull up a site on there. You're a lot of that's going to be the same, no matter if it's iOS or Android. But then there comes with the actual native applications because one, you're developing in different languages. iOS is going to be Swift. Android is was it I always forget it's Java, or was it Kotlin,
I think it's
or like
Kotlin, right?
yeah,
Yeah.
Kotlin. I was forget. And so just in that um just in it's like, and I can't, it's the reason I'm like forgetting, like different, there are differences, and I'm
Hmm.
sometimes I felt like hamburger menus between iOS and Android are sometimes handled differently. I've come up where you kind of I've come up where I've been testing two native applications, and iOS, the hamburger menu, the three lines,
Hmm.
it states that it's a menu that you can go into it, and then Android, it's like it's just it's like JavaScript control, and having to figure out what's like, okay, what why is it doing that, and things like that. So there's some different, it really
Hmm.
not getting too in the weeds, that yeah, there are some, and also I think some of those differences come about that people seem more comfortable with iOS application development versus
Okay.
Android, and especially in not get I don't want to get too comfortable with that. Um, Especially when it comes to accessibility, there seems to be more focus on iOS than
Hmm.
Android, which does cause issues, especially when you're looking for the accessibility of applications. Where that's why there seems to be like iOS application seems way far and beyond like advanced when it comes to accessibility than Android applications. And there's a lot into there. I don't want to go too deep into that
Sure.
because yeah, we'll be here all day, and I don't. That's not what we're here for.
Hmm. Speaking of what we're here for, I think now is a good time to start diving into this.
Yes.
So I am now sharing your screen. We are looking at this Welcome to Xcode dialogue. Uh,
Yeah.
yeah.
So we're doing this. I could have, hooked up a my own iPhone, but that's my work phone, so I was definitely not going to do that. so so we are going to look at we're going to test the Amazon mobile web site using the simulator through Xcode. I've I have a video coming out on how that gets more into this detail later this week. But I just wanted to kind of show people now how to go into this. So yeah, and this is great for because I mean a lot of people don't have companies, especially as startups, you don't have the money to go into, to get all these different like actual devices and
Hmm.
things. So to open up the simulator, it's so you go to Xcode, you go up to Open Developer Tools, and then you just go to Simulator, and that is going to just pop up the simulator I have. Can you see?
Yeah.
Okay. And does it tell you? Because I'm like, this little bar is in my way for Zoom. And so I,
Oh no. Yeah.
it's okay.
It does. It does say it's an iPhone 12 Pro Max.
Okay, good.
We
I
see
was
that
like,
loud
that's
and
okay.
clear. Yep.
Yes. And I just want to say, if when you can change which device you're using. So if you go into so funny, what I'm like, it's like, oh, I'm like, what am I doing? So if you wanted to add a different like older like say an older iOS version, you actually would go back to Xcode, and then you would go into preferences and then components, and that will allow you to add some older iOS versions. Just beware, these things can take up like I always tell people, do not download every single one unless you have a lot. I have seen that before, and it does not turn out good. But so I just wanted to point that out. So yeah, so we're simulating an iPhone 12 Pro Max, iOS 14.5, and so and like I said, we're going to go into um, Amazon, which I already have.
Nice.
And so now we're actually going to open up the accessibility inspector. So let me get this out of the way. And then here we will, unless it's not, okay. Cool. Okay. So with this is and this is something I tend to use, and it's very valuable when it comes to um, testing applications for accessibility on iOS. Now, this is really for testing native applications, but when you're using the simulator, you actually can't download through the App Store, like in apps. Like you have to have your you have to
Mm.
have the application that you're, through like usually like through test flight, download it onto your computer and then onto the simulator. But I have used this before just where I'm testing a mobile website as well. But there's going to be some things that you won't get to use, and I'll go through that a little bit as I kind of go through this as we go through the app to or the the page together. So yeah, so let's start. There is with the accessibility simulator, you have the inspection tool where you can kind of go through everything, kind of like as if you want, like you can you kind of zero in on particular elements that you want to look at. So right here, I'm on the Amazon logo, and it will tell you some basic things. Again, since this is not a native application, there's going to be just some things, there's going to be some things that
Hmm.
one that won't pop up, and that's usually kind of down here. Oh, actually, we did get some stuff with this. I was surprised. So sometimes if you're using the inspector on a mobile web application that's like not yours, you won't get some of this information
Hmm.
that you would get with a native application, but you do. And this is, again, a lot of this is for the, it's focused towards developers
Okay.
as they're kind of but I tend to like to use it just to kind of see like what's going on, what is the more information, that's kind of how I, the more information, the better. And I think I'm getting a little ahead of myself because I just jumped in when it comes to, I'm like, here you go. And that's one of the things because I'm kind of, I'm in my zone.
Mhm.
But when it comes to testing mobile, you know, mobile, for mobile accessibility, then, I'll kind of go through how I start before just, and then we'll jump
Mhm.
back into it. And mainly, I do like to, I really do think it's important, and I really stress having actual devices. This, having a simulator or emulator is fine, but there are just some things that you can't I replicate, and that is the user experience, and
Mhm.
that is when using gestures and things like that, and also actually adding peripherals onto the
Mm.
device and seeing how that works. I've found issues where there is where like one of the things you have to be mindful is target size. Like the size of buttons and things like that, and whereas it may seem like, and for the most part, you can have some automated tools that will tell you and give you, some, warnings about maybe the target size is too small. We can see that there's an audit tool for the accessibility inspector that will kind of do that. But sometimes you can't. That's one of the things why you can't trust automated, just completely depend on it because sometimes it's not about the size, it's actually about the location. And I've had
Mm.
that happen where I am, where the gesture is, I'm trying to gesture and it's the placement. And so things are getting in the way. I call it, baby fingering it. Oh, no, that's a baby finger because I'm like, I have, where I'm trying to like move things around the screen and, uh, and it's not working.
Mhm.
so I definitely stress you know real devices when you can. Also, especially when it comes to using the screen reader. So, VoiceOver for iOS, TalkBack for Android. That also makes a difference. But with the accessibility inspector, you actually can, um, have it speak what, have
Ooh.
it announce what VoiceOver does. I don't know if you'll be able to actually hear it, but I think it will come up on the screen.
Let's try it.
So yeah, I don't. Uh, so it is announcing, but I think it's only announcing to me.
Okay.
But what it says is open menu button,
Mm.
and so because sometimes that doesn't match up where you have it where voiceover or the screen reader will announce something else. And so yeah, so that's something that you definitely comes up a lot with with screen readers that you have to make sure that it's announcing what you want it to announce. So yeah, so like let's go. I know I'm going to I'm kind of like teaching to the tool, but I just wanted to make sure that it's kind of, since this is up on the screen, that everyone knows that what this is for and what it's doing.
Yeah.
So okay, so that I so mainly when I come into like when I first like an application and start, I use Amazon all the time, but I tend to kind of play around with it, like if I'm doing so kind of exploratory testing, if I don't have any sort of kind of like list or kind of actual user case or some kind of test that I need to run. Definitely, and that's because a lot of times I feel that by having that freedom, just as someone who uses accessibility settings and tools on that's kind of like I'll surf, like I'm surfing the internet. So I sound so old, but that's kind of like what I'll go to a new site and I'm just kind of playing around with it, and I discover a lot of accessibility issues. It's usually way more frustrating because it's just I'm in personally I'm just going to a site expecting to work and it doesn't. So with
Mhm.
this, I it's. I would just kind of come in and then just start to navigate.
Are so
And
you're doing the things that you as a user would just straight up expect to be able to do.
yes, exactly. Yeah, like because that's kind of, I mean, that's what this is for. I know that, especially when it comes to testing, when it comes to, auditing and whatever that, you have specific objectives a lot of times, but overall, the one thing that you really do need is that it is about your customers and your users, and you really do. And I know I'm only one person. I have kind of, biases, and, particular my impairments are different from other people, but I'm still, at the end of the day, a user, a customer. So, that's kind of going off my experience, and then going from there about, okay, well, I had this particular issue, but what about someone else who, had a, like maybe this, and kind of going from there. So yeah, so actually I think, if you want to give me some, like, things you want to see, because I think I'm, I feel like I'm being a little bit chaotic in my
No, yeah. So, I mean, this is just generally how you're approaching it, right? Is like as a user who wants to do usery things, right? Like I think there's like two different paths you can take with quality assurance. There's like I am what I would expect is just a normal user doing normal user things. Like, I want to go buy a product. And then there's like the other path that's like, I'm going to do all of the weirdest stuff I can do, right? Find the absolute edge cases and figure out like what the edges of the experience are. I think both approaches are necessary for QA, but especially if you haven't been given that kind of direction of like, here's a particular flow, right? Going at this as you as a user would is I think very valuable. So let's say maybe the flow we're talking about Amazon here. Maybe we want to like buy a product or something like that. Maybe like that is what you use Amazon for. So maybe that's a flow that you could walk us through how you would test.
yeah. So for me, like, now, since I don't have, like, I one of the things that I usually do is turn on the screen reader, but since we're not really we're not doing an actual device, and since
Hmm.
everyone would have been able to hear the audio announcements, what I would do is mainly start looking like color contrast, hit targets. So one thing that we can do is, like, okay, let's say we want to buy a fire stick. And so this is, the page for the Fire Stick. With this, one of the things I do with the accessibility is run an audit on the. Again, it's going to kind of pick out some of the, like, kind of the, I think, easier finds
Okay.
for me, and then that's a good way for me to kind of go from there. So right now I just have it going,
Ooh.
and yeah. So these are all the, kind of things that the accessibility inspector says this is something that may want to come to your attention. So if I collapse the first item, so it's saying with this particular contrast fail for the element, the text content ratio is 1.6 is the space. And so again, that's a good, a good, a good pickup, a good, something that, you know, because it's one of those things of, I know that my computer, I have this, it's because I actually have high contrast on my
Mm.
computer right now, so it actually, I can see it. So, and that's one of those things I also have to make, I have to account for, is that when I'm doing some of this testing, especially if I'm doing a simulator, that I have my own accessibility
Oh yeah.
settings on, and that could potentially. So this is one of those things of, like, it's like, I'm like, oh well, I didn't realize that, but that's also because I have, high contrast on, so it's helped me see a little, some of these elements a little bit better.
Mm-hmm.
And from here, like, it will, you know
Oh.
go and start picking through things. This one's kind of, and some of these things are obvious at, especially as you get, more, kind of, as you pick up more kind of, experience with, like, this type of testing of, like, yeah, you can kind of tell off the bat. For me, I know with my visual impairments, a lot of times it's very easy to pick up if something is, fails color contrast because I can't see it or I can barely see it.
Hmm.
But yeah, so with this, and I kind of, did uh, with my own on my own phone, I know a lot of this stuff anyway. So yeah, more kind of more issues with color contrast. Um,
Well,
again, and the thing is that you can't completely rely on this. This is something that you definitely want to go and check because some of these tools they're great, but they are not to take the place of actual
mhm.
manual testing and kind of going in. So if for me with this, I would go in and dig into like the code to make sure that that is actually correct because sometimes I've had it where it's actually not correct. So I want to make sure that what the inspector is telling me is actually true.
Yeah,
So
because like a 1.01 to 1 ratio, like that's like no one would do that intentionally, right? Like,
yeah,
yeah, there's bad color contrast out there, but this looks like someone was intentionally trying to hide a thing, or maybe the auto tool like flagged it incorrectly or something like that. Like they meant to hide it. Um,
yeah,
yeah.
and then so some of this is also that it's and this is what I think it's the auto contrast it doesn't scroll
Oh,
so some of the
interesting.
yeah so that's one of the things again one of those little quirks using this for mobile web instead of native application but you're not going to get the full effect of this so it wasn't scrolling with this let me so again, it's still it's a great tool, but there are
Hmm.
some parts with you when you're not. It's like when you use it for off-label use.
Yeah.
Let's get into some other stuff. So I'm gonna find okay. Um, so element has no description, but and so it does show you right here what like the screenshot or capture of what it's talking about. This again, this is why it's also automated tools you have to
Hmm.
use kind of in conjunction because I don't think this would need this particular this is something I'm trying to figure out where that is actually on this way. It may not be, so I'm like that wouldn't actually need it.
Is that just the whole page?
Yeah, this is
Wait,
just
wait, wait. This simulator kit dot sim display renderable view is missing useful accessibility information. This is just saying that the simulator's not accessible.
yes, it is.
Come on, Apple.
um,
Okay. Uh,
yes. So let's go back. So I
yeah.
just wanted to show that like, that's a good, and something that I instruct a lot of people on with automated like kind of automated tool testing tools is that a good workflow to have is to use those tools
Hmm.
um, like to run those tools and get like and get a good list of what some of the issues they are advising that you change and then from there use that as a jumping off point especially for those who are new to accessibility and accessibility testing so they can kind of
Hmm.
use like allow them to kind of find those initial kind of big kind of like pretty glaring issues and then from there let that take you onto different paths of like one verifying is that actually correct or is it
Hmm.
not or is it or is it actually not an issue if it is then where from there going in a lot of times they different tools not this one they'll actually tell you other things to look for that
Yeah.
they can't like Lighthouse on Chrome in Chrome DevTools. Also Axe if you're running the extension on the browser extension will give you advice
Hmm.
on like well we found these but you should also check for other different things.
That
Um,
now that I'm thinking about that, that really your approach of like let the automatic tool surface a whole bunch of things and then investigate and figure out like are these false positives and stuff. Like that mirrors my own accessibility learning experience where like I would run Axe DevTools against my app at work and something would come up and then my next question would be, okay, why is this an issue? Like what like not just how do I resolve this, but like why was this even flagged in the first place? And that was how I learned a lot of what I now know about accessibility was by following that kind of that tree of questions there that all
yes.
started by running the automated audit.
Yes, yeah, and that's and for me too. Like it was one of those things of like you know using checklists, and I know sometimes checkpoints get kind of a bad rap when it comes because you have people who may just test to the checklist and not go beyond that. But for me, I when I was first learning, especially with native applications, I would use this checklist and then kind of explore because I had to because
Mm-hmm.
at the time I started, it was WCAG 2.0, and you had to kind of take the guidelines and the success criteria that were geared towards desktop web and then try to map them to mobile. So
Mm.
I was doing a lot. I was doing a lot of that. So I was taking these checklists that were not for mobile and native applications, and then having to like, okay, well, if that's what it would be on for a desktop application, what would that be like on a native application or a
Mm-hmm.
mobile web, site? And that's one of the things. I guess I should start off. I know we're not doing a lot of kind of no like kind of auditing, like hands-on auditing, but a lot of this is like very important even before a lot of it's just getting information. Like if you're new to mobile accessibility and mobile accessibility auditing and testing, one of the things that you really do, I think the first thing you really do is really kind of understand how understanding how mobile applications work and how especially kind of getting the feel of like, well, what's like what does iOS app development look like? I'm not saying you need to go and learn these things, but just kind of understand like what does iOS application look like? What does Android application development looks like? They both have really good, um, especially documentation about accessible, like for developers are like this is how you do accessibility when developing a native app. So that's one things I always really tell people do is
Mm-hmm.
read that documentation because yes it's geared towards the developers but it's really valuable for testing because it does get you like okay what the like when you like what are the um what does the OS provide for you when it in terms for accessibility and thinking about some of the things that could potentially go wrong or kind of kind of bug out with that and that especially for some of your harder issues that are beyond just like color contrast or hit sizes or things like that also getting more familiar with like when I started out, yeah, it was recap on 2.0 and kind of mapping that, but 2.1 actually did add some new success criteria when it comes to that are geared towards mobile application. I actually did a talk about that. It's called "It's Always Sunny in Mobile Accessibility." I love "It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia," and so I kind of go through the success criteria in 2.1 that are geared towards mobile accessibility, and that's things like, and I'm going to read off on my list. So if I'm looking at
I
I
am getting a link.
tried to memorize WCAG. uh, it's um, so yeah, like orientation, that's something very because sometimes you get applications that will try to lock you into one orientation. So it's like, okay, you're going to be in profile, like it this this app will only allow you to be profile versus landscape. And that's one of the things that if you are locking in, are you restricting a user to use one particular orientation, unless it's something like a video game where that is important
Hmm.
to the actual, then you're going to fill that criteria.
Can you
You
help me
have
understand why? Like, why would that be an issue?
it comes, sometimes it is, I'm going to be, um, just because of someone who has depending on like motor skills and mobility, that could be, and like a definite issue. I know for me that I sometimes have to like even for like visual impairment, I will have to rotate it to landscape sometimes to actually to allow like it's like the flow of of the of the screen helps me read better.
Okay.
And then also it's easier for me to zoom in on things if I have it in landscape um, versus portrait. So really, it's
Hmm.
unless it's like, and it's also it's like, why do you need to restrict it if it's not necessary for the app, like the use of the application? With games, it makes it does it's logical because depending on the game, that orientation, like you can't, there's not very many games that you can play in like portrait mode.
Hmm.
Like it has to be like because it has to be in landscape mode, so that it does make logical sense that you would have that locked into
Hmm.
landscape mode. But unless there's some really good reason, you shouldn't, because that could potentially limit the user and really prevent them and block them from using your app.
Hmm.
um
The
so
the use case I had heard was, for instance, like some folks might mount their phone or tablet to like their
yes,
wheelchair.
yes, exactly. Yeah, yeah, and like so if you're doing that, especially like because there are some like with certain peripherals, like I know on my Android phone, the input is going to be at the at the bottom. So if it's locked into portrait, then I can't actually add a like something for my for if I'm going to add a peripheral to my phone, because it's only, I can only have it set a certain way, and I can't add it. I physically can't add anything. So yes, that's all, that's that as well.
Gotcha.
um yeah, and so there's a lot, there's things with you know orientation. I won't go through all of them. But motion and something, also motion actuation, where the like actions are done by motion. I know one I there was a thing called like, and I'm forgetting, but my there were some updates to Android, or at least like my particular phone, where you could bring up menus by shaking the phone,
Okay.
and and so if you're going to have things like that where the actions are taking place by motions, you need to provide an alternative for people who can't say do that particular motion. Something that you also bring like with
Hmm.
like wheelchairs, and especially if you do have your phone mounted on your wheelchair, and
Hmm.
motion is going to set off some actions. That is that is
Yeah.
going to particularly end up setting off some actions that you don't want, because you have the motion of the of the wheelchair, you have the
Hmm.
and the phone is also, so providing that is well. So that's one of the things when it comes to uh I know it's a getting familiar with some of those kind of success criteria in WCAG that are they're geared towards mobile accessibility is a huge, I'd say, necessity when you're doing, or when you're kind of introducing mobile accessibility testing or auditing as like well. So yeah, before you even kind of break out any sort of device or simulator emulator, kind of reading up on that is very it will be very helpful as you start to dig in and do some of the stuff yourself. Yeah, so so yeah, so a lot of that information, there's a lot that goes into before I even go in. It's, there's some things like, one of the things I do, this is why I do prefer having a, when I can, but a lot of times, sometimes that is just not, uh, possible. I like having in a device because I do like doing the gestures. Like the one thing is here, I'm doing the gestures via a mouse, and or a touchpad on a laptop, and that doesn't really, I think with this
Mhm.
one, it causes issues that that's not how the user is going to be using this. So I'm kind of trying to mimic. Also, that can cause some issues where, if I tried to get out of this, sometimes I struggle with like switching between apps. But so I know we're talking, we're not doing a lot of like, this is an issue, this is an issue, and this is an issue. I
Mhm.
think one of the things that it's like, I think it's like, it's more that, having that information, like the actual doing and finding the things is, is going to, I trust people will be able to do that, but having that, that knowledge and that information beforehand will save you a lot of trouble, because this is a lot of this is a lot of knowledge that was hard won for me. So yeah, so with the rest of this, like, again, for me, like, if since I don't really, since going with like the color contrast, like text, especially kind of target sizes, like that's, what I would, that's kind of the quick, what I would look for here without having, voiceover, that like, because I can't go with voiceover with here. And then I
Mhm.
would go into voiceover and start kind of using it, especially, kind of going through a flow of buying this. So I don't have anything. So let's put this to cart. I don't have anything connected to this, so I can't buy anything.
Mhm.
um, like, and with this, it's like, yeah, kind of using voiceover, kind of, going, zooming in. So one thing that you can do, this is also something you can increase contrast, um, which actually may not work because this is not a native application.
Mm.
Because yeah, like if I invert colors, it inverts all of my colors. So it's supposed to stick to, but this is also, you can, especially for testing, you can reduce motion. These are also some, tools that you can use along with the existing accessor inspector. Um, yeah, so it's one of those things of I feel like I'm going all over the place, but that's kind of where the things that I fully admit that my testing can be very the kind of chaotic when I'm exploring, because it's just kind of like, well, that's how I like that.
Mhm.
I find a lot of stuff, because it's like, I it's one thing to use a application has, the company or the developer see as fit, but actual people don't do that. And then, when it comes to, I can't force my disabilities to behave in a certain way. So I can, wake up one day and, I will definitely have some really bad vision days where, it's, and so it's one of those things of like, I can't, um, there's, there's something to be said. Yes, having user stories and user flows and particular test scripts to do, and those are great and those are needed, but there's also something to be said to one, exploratory testing, also getting actual, users for user acceptance testing,
Mhm.
paid, stress paid, paid testers, because that to actually test your applications, especially when it comes to native, like applications, because it is, though, smartphones and, mobile phones have been, have been here for quite a while. I think when it comes to development, when it comes to testing, and especially when it comes to accessibility, these things are very new in the kind of the forward, kind of like in the foreground for people. So
Hmm.
really getting people in for, testing native applications, testing mobile websites to really, get the feel of like, well, people who are, this is geared towards, who this is focused towards, for things.
We got Rachel in the chat who is plus oneing testing with disabled users. Totally agree. I think one of the things that's been striking me about this conversation, and perhaps like some of this is a limitation of just even the technology required to make a stream happen, but I don't think I had quite realized, despite the fact that I am a like physically disabled phone user, I hadn't quite realized how much of this was really grounded in physicality in a way that like desktop web development isn't so much. Like things like considering gestures and is something like easy to reach. The hit size, like yes, we do worry about target size on web apps, but I mean, we also kind of don't, right?
Yeah.
It's there, it's a consideration, there's requirements, but it's less a big deal, I think, than like target sizes on mobile, just because with mobile it's a lot easier to fat finger something, right?
Yes,
Uh,
exactly.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and I definitely have, and that's a, yeah, that's a, issue where, yeah, like the sometimes the layout and design of things where, on, and that's where you have to be mindful, because I think there's a lot of things where like, oh well, we're not going to worry about mobile web,
Mm-hmm.
and it's like, well, and so we'll have our desktop, site, and then we're like, well, we're not going to worry about mobile web. But the thing is that more and more people, their main computer is their phone. There
Mm-hmm.
is a smartphone. And so you have to worry about mobile web, because for a lot of people, they don't, they don't actually have, reliable internet, like for their, like for their desktop computer. And the way they actually have reliable internet is their phone. And so if you don't say have an app, and your people are needing your services, you're, wanting to buy something, they're going onto their phone. And if your like layout is just not really, optimized for mobile, you're, it's just bad usability anyway. But for someone who has disabilities, it can really be a blocker. And if it's just something that they really do need, say if Amazon, where this was way more, just like, and for them, for the most part, I'm showcasing Amazon. That's because people are familiar with Amazon, but
Mm-hmm.
but if this was a lot more where it was kind of like, well, we don't really, that's not our focus. We'll have an app soon, and so they can go there. It could be a pretty, it could be a dire situation.
I work in banking, right? And it's like, yeah,
Mhm.
if you don't have access to banking, like that is a critical issue.
Yes. Yeah. And yeah, there's, and I know I've gone to, like before my bank really had a good mobile, like a good native application, going to the going to their mobile site, trying to log in with,
Mm-hmm.
with a screen reader. It was like, and I was like, oh, I'm going to have to go in person to, and I'm like, how do I do that? And it was one of those things of like, and they came out very, soon after with a native application, but that doesn't help people from, where it's like, I don't really have, I don't have, you know, I can't, I don't have reliable internet on my desk for my desktop. You don't have a native, application that, solves some of these issues. I'm going onto your mobile website, but your mobile website is just your desktop site
Yeah.
on a mobile screen, and it is all over the place.
Mm-hmm. Joe is talking about kind of like the comments that we you especially were making about like most folks are on their mobile devices, like that's their primary way of accessing the web. Joe says, I think this is spot on and really important, as I feel like devs can be really guilty of forgetting about just how many mobile users there are because they're sat in front of a desktop or laptop all day.
Yeah. Yeah, it's one of those things. It's very easy, and it's one of the and it's also because mobile usage for people and for everyone, but also for disabled people, really has grown so exponentially over the last very short years, and so it's one of those things of you know going from just like say you know, it's like beginning of like I don't know like 2005 where yeah there was mobile like there were phones but they weren't really smart and then after the iPhone premiered it
Hmm.
just kind of just there and then you started getting Android and all these different and it just really the amount of people and people realized that it's cheaper to get and some yeah a lot of times it's cheaper to get data on your phone than for a lot of people than actually getting internet service in
Mm.
their home. There's also people in rural areas and also in who live in inner cities who where there actually aren't there's not actually the infrastructure or the cost of actually getting lines run into particular residential areas is really I,
Yeah.
so I feel like I taking over it where you're like, we're gonna do some auditing today.
No, this is great. I think that's hugely important. And so I've been really enjoying this. Were there other things you wanted to show, other parts of your process that you think folks should see?
For me, no, I think this is like I think my main thing with this is that one, if you're someone who wants to do mobile accessibility testing, you one should test on different apps. Should also test on not the latest kind of the latest version. You should also test on older versions, older devices because not everyone is going to have the iPhone 12 Pro Max. I don't even know. I'm almost an Android user, so I was like I don't so, and so I'm like I don't know if that's new, but for whatever new because I know they're actually doing an announcement today. So
I think like
so
during this stream, even I had some people reaching out like I want to make your stream, but also Apple. I'm like totally understandable.
yeah, but it's important to do, and so I know it's really hard to get your hands on devices. I
Hmm.
was definitely I was definitely that person when I was doing mobile access, asking people like, what device is that? Can I borrow? Really, like, can I borrow your phone to test something on? Or asking people to like, but it's important because not everyone, has the newest and greatest thing. So the like using a simulator like this is really good. It's not a replacement for the real thing, but it definitely can help you get to get in there and find some issues. Especially if you only have, if you only have a few, a one actual device, that's it. That has to be it. And then at least you can do find some of those bigger issues that the simulators can find. Definitely utilize accessibility like automation tools, but don't rely on them for everything because as we talked about like the physicality of mobile devices is very important and these automated tools can only do so much versus actually it's like yeah propping like attaching a mobile device to a wheelchair. That's something that actually should be you should go to a user and and ask them to to do that and see what their experiences are. Again, paid, but that nothing's going to an automated tool can't replicate that and
Hmm.
can't find those unique issues that could come from around that. And also just learn just kind of yeah use the documentation that is for accessibility that's geared towards developers and go into WCAG and familiar yourself with the kind of the new kind of it's new, but it's since out since 2018, but the updated mobile accessibility success criteria.
All right. Yeah, I think that is a fantastic place to leave this. Crystal, thank you so much for coming on. I'd love to I guess kind of shout out things that are going on. What kinds of things would you like to promote?
So I have a series on kind of getting started with mobile accessibility testing. Right now out is the my series is called Accessibility Savvy. Right out that's out. I put out a video getting started with Android Studio and how to emulate Android devices. Coming up Thursday, which is in 2 days because I forgot what today was. I will put out this second part, which is exploring this with iOS and this in an accessibility inspector. I will also be talking next week at Inclusive Design 24 and talking about everyone needs WAP, web accessibility, please. Making sure to get that web accessibility, please, on there. That is what WAP stands for. And I don't know about any other
No, of course not. There is
definition.
only one.
Yes, only one. And that's going to be focused on how to, really, as a sense, like web accessibility for everyone. So really, how to communicate and talk to people outside of tech, outside, about accessibility, about disability, and yeah. So those are the. And then next month, I am doing a talk for Denver Startup Week, which is called How to Pitch Accessibility, which is good for people in startup companies, how to really go about getting their companies to focus on accessibility, because that's an issue for a lot of people I've talked to in startups on how to, a lot of things about startups about being air, kind of like one way, being lean and all that, but accessibility is still important. So trying to help people, employees in that situation on how to kind of pitch it and make sure that it's there from the very start.
All
That's
right.
it.
Well, awesome. I've put some links in the chat. Crystal, this has been fantastic. Thank you so much for coming on. I've really enjoyed chatting with you. This was a delight. And chat, I'm super excited to have had you along this ride as well. You should join us the next few weeks, same time, same place, 12 p.m. Central, right here. Next week we're gonna have Alexa Heinrich come on to demonstrate social media accessibility, which I think is going to have a lot of overlap with kind of the web accessibility stuff that I usually do. Um, and the week after that, we've got Rachel DiTulio, who's been in the chat today. We're going to be doing form accessibility. So it's all good stuff. Let me put a link to the Some Antics Twitter in the chat as well so that you can go follow that and keep up to date with all the latest streams. But yeah, stick around. We'll find someone to raid. And yeah, thanks for coming, y'all. Bye.